The first time I saw my own work being used to sell a $600 million story, I was sitting in the back row like I was lucky to be in the room. Owen Voss stood under the screen in a navy suit that still had the sharp, stiff look of something chosen for him by somebody richer and older. He had one hand in his pocket and the other clicking through slides I had built over 18 months of missed weekends, client escalations, broken systems, and quiet disasters nobody else at Northreach had wanted to touch. My timelines were up there. My risk map was up there. My integration model was up there. Even the phrasing was mine. He was using lines I had said in executive meetings almost word for word. The only thing missing was my name. My name is Mara Ellison Grant. I should probably tell you now because that matters. Oh, I was 41 then, and I was Senior Vice President of Enterprise Integration and Diligence at Northreach Health Platforms, which sounds dry until you understand what it meant. Every serious piece of post-acquisition work at that company moved through me. Every major integration schedule, every client transition checkpoint, every diligence tracker, every risk sign-off. When Northreach bought 3 damaged healthcare software companies and tried to glue them together into one growth platform, I was the glue. And Owen was up there presenting it like he had invented gravity. The room was cold in that expensive way boardrooms always are. Too much glass, too much steel, bottled water placed in exact lines. Bankers at one side of the table, 2 board members near the center, outside counsel by the wall. You investors from the lead funds taking notes with the stillness of people trained to look relaxed while they decide who is real and who is decorative. Daniel Voss, our CEO, sat at the head of the table with the calm smile of a man watching his son step into a future he had already paid for. Then Owen said the sentence that told me this was bigger than theft. "The platform is now self-running," he said, tapping the screen with the remote. "We've removed legacy personnel dependency from the integration layer." A few people nodded. One investor wrote something down. I felt my stomach turn cold, because that line was not just false, it was dangerous. He clicked to the next slide before I could even process the level of stupidity it took to say that in a room full of people who were about to rely on it, while I stopped looking at him and started looking at the deck itself. He had removed the readiness warnings. He had removed the unresolved risk page. He had removed the transition conditions tied to 2 hospital systems. Worst of all, he had removed the control signature page that linked the entire certification chain to my office. That was when I understood what Daniel and Owen had done. This was not a presentation choice. It was a public erasure. Owen kept going, warm now, confident now, smiling like the room belonged to him. He talked about margin lift. He talked about platform stability. He talked about integration risk being closed. He said the company was ready for a $600 million growth round because the messy part was over. The messy part. I almost laughed at that, because the messy part was still alive in client writers' diligence language and operational controls he clearly had not read, or had read and thought he could ignore because his last name carried more weight than mine. I could have stopped him. I could have said, right there in front of the board, "That slide is false." I could have asked why my name had disappeared. I could have made it ugly. I did none of that. I sat still. I took notes. I watched exactly which lies he was willing to say out loud. And when the meeting ended, I already knew one thing with perfect clarity. They thought they had embarrassed me. What they had really done was build a $600 million investor story on documents that still needed my certification, my continuity status, and my controlled client approvals to be true. And they had just said the dangerous part out loud in front of the only people who mattered. The meeting ended with the kind of fake applause people use when money is close and honesty is not. I stayed in my chair a few seconds longer than everyone else. Not because I was shocked. That part had already passed. I stayed because I wanted to see who came to Owen first. It was Daniel, of course. He stood, put a hand on his son's shoulder, and leaned in with that low, private smile men like him use when they think they've just secured a dynasty. One of the bankers shook Owen's hand. An investor asked if he would be leading diligence calls going forward. Owen said, "Yes, operationally, that's already underway." Operationally. I remember that word because it was the moment I understood the presentation had not been the insult. It had been the announcement. By the time I got back to my office, HR had already sent the memo. It was called a temporary transition adjustment, which was corporate language for theft with a clean font. 2 directors from my team were being shifted to Owen. My access to investor data preparation was being narrowed. Client integration meetings would now be routed through the CEO's office. Diligence materials would be executively aligned before circulation. My role was still intact on paper, but the authority inside it had been hollowed out. A few minutes later, Daniel appeared in my doorway without knocking. He closed the glass door behind him and gave me the kind of patient look senior men save for women they think should take a humiliation professionally. "This is a visibility decision, Mara," he said. Investors respond better to forward-facing leadership." I looked at him and asked, "You mean your son?" His jaw tightened, but only for a second. "I mean the next phase of the company." That was the part that actually hurt. Not because I was naive. I had worked around executive ego long enough to know credit theft was real. But Northreach had survived its last 2 acquisitions because I had done the work nobody wanted near their name. I had sat with furious hospital clients at 11 at night. I had rebuilt transition maps after failed launches. I had absorbed compliance gaps, staffing holes, broken claims systems, and delayed reporting that could have crushed our valuation if they had surfaced at the wrong time. I had made the company investable. And then now Daniel was trying to turn me into support staff right before the biggest financing event in our history. Owen walked in before Daniel left, smiling like he had been invited to watch the cleanup. "We'll still need your technical insight," he said. "This isn't personal." That almost impressed me. The nerve, the theft, the confidence. I did not raise my voice. I did not ask either of them to explain the timing. Men like that only get cleaner when you fight too early. So I let them talk, and while they talked, I started noticing what they had changed and what they had not. The memo removed my visibility. It did not remove the client writers. It did not change the diligence certification path. It did not rewrite board-approved integration governance. Owen thought he had taken my seat. Oh, he had no idea he had also stepped into a structure he could not legally fake. I did not go home early that night. I closed my office door, took off my blazer, set my phone face down on the desk, and opened the folder Daniel thought I would be too angry to touch carefully. That was their first mistake. People like Daniel and Owen always assume humiliation makes you messy. They count on outrage. They want a scene, a bad email, a raised voice in a hallway, something they can point to later and call instability. What they never know what to do with is silence from someone who understands the architecture better than they do. Northreach's investor story looked simple from the outside. 3 acquisitions, 1 unified healthcare platform, cleaner operations, bigger margins, more predictable revenue. That was the version on the slides. The real version was uglier and far more fragile. Those 3 companies had not come to us healthy. One had a broken claims workflow. One had missing support coverage in 2 regions. One had reporting controls that looked neat in diligence and turned rotten the second you traced them into production. We had spent a year and a half stitching those pieces together while trying not to lose the hospital systems paying for them. That was my job. Not branding, not speeches. Survival. During the second integration crisis, When two major hospital groups were close to freezing expansion, I had negotiated continuity riders into their transition agreements. The language was narrow, but it mattered. If operational control over integration shifted without disclosure and client approval, those customers could pause milestones, hold payments, or demand formal remediation. In plain English, if Northreach changed who was actually responsible for keeping the machine stable, the clients had the right to slow everything down until they trusted the change. Those were not small accounts. They were the accounts investors were using to justify the valuation. And that was only one side of the trap. Inside the financing process, the bank had already loaded a management representation package into the data room. That package said the integration timeline, compliance readiness, and client retention assumptions were materially accurate. It was not a ceremonial document. It was the written backbone of the story being sold. And the final certification path for that package ran through my office. Not Daniel's, not Owen's, mine. I pulled up the version history from the deck Owen had used and compared it to the working file my team had finalized 2 weeks earlier. The differences were surgical. My unresolved risk page was gone. A staffing gap in post-launch support had disappeared. A claims mapping issue inside one acquired product line had been removed. A hospital-specific approval condition tied to my continuity status had been erased completely. They had not just stolen my work. They had cleaned it until it became false. That was the moment I finally admitted to myself why I had stayed quiet in the room. If I had interrupted Owen live, Daniel would have called it executive tension, personal conflict, a disagreement over roles. He would have smiled that patient smile and told the investors we were aligned internally. The truth would have become noise. By staying silent, I had let them lock themselves into the lie in front of the board, the lawyers, the investors, and the bankers. Now it lived in notes, in memory, and in the official version of the story they had chosen to tell. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen. Owen thought he had stolen the spotlight. What he had really done was step onto a floor I had designed, sign his name to the wrong version of reality, and dare the facts to stay buried. They were not buried. They were organized. The next morning, I stopped trying to protect people who had already decided I was disposable. I did not storm into Daniel's office. I did not call Owen reckless. I did not warn anyone that they were playing with disclosure risk and client authority like it was office theater. I did something far more dangerous. I started building a record that could survive lawyers. First, I preserved everything. I saved the investor deck history, not just the final file. I pulled the internal operating model, the diligence tracker, the red risk memo, and the version logs showing exactly when the warning pages disappeared and who had touched them. I exported the board-approved integration charter. I downloaded the client continuity riders. I pulled the last 3 certification workflows where my office had been listed as the approval path. Then I built a clean timeline, hour by hour, document by document, so that no one could later pretend this had all happened through confusion. Chronology matters when powerful people lie. If you let them tell the story in themes, they can blur it. If you pin them to dates, edits, emails, and approvals, the room gets smaller. Once the internal record was clean, I reached out to the 2 people most likely to care about process more than politics. The first was Lena Ortiz, our Deputy General Counsel. Lena was not warm, but she was exact. I trusted exact. I sent her a short email with no accusations in it at all. I asked 3 questions. Who had approved the removal of the integration risk pages from the investor materials? Who had authorized the shift in operating control language tied to client continuity provisions? And who was now expected to sign readiness statements historically routed through my function? She replied 23 minutes later. Looking into it. That was enough. The second was Priya Shah, chair of the audit committee. Priya hated two things more than most people in corporate life: surprises and sloppy records. And I did not send her conclusions either. I sent her one line that said I wanted to flag a governance-sensitive inconsistency between current investor materials and board-approved integration controls, and that I was documenting it carefully before escalating. Priya wrote back almost immediately, "Keep the record clean. Send only what you can support." Again, enough. Then I tightened the trap. I sent Owen a polished, harmless-looking note. I asked him to confirm, for diligence consistency, that the deck presented to investors reflected current integration status and that no named person dependency remained in the operating structure. I knew exactly what kind of man he was, and exactly how men like him respond when they think they are already above the people they stole from. Oh, he replied with confidence and copied half the people I wanted copied. "Yes," he wrote. "The current deck is aligned with operational reality. No material named person dependency remains." I read that sentence twice. Then I saved it in 3 places. The bank uploaded the final deck into the data room later that afternoon. I saw the notification come through and did nothing to stop it. That mattered too. If they wanted the false version to become official, I wanted it preserved exactly as they told it. Not corrected halfway, not softened in a follow-up call. Official. By then, Daniel and Owen had already started mistaking my silence for surrender. Meetings moved around me. Invitations disappeared. My authority was treated like furniture they had every right to rearrange. And every hour they acted more comfortable, my position got stronger. Because the fight was no longer happening in conference rooms. It was happening on paper. And paper does not care whose son you are. By the end of that week, Owen had stopped acting like a man borrowing authority and started acting like a man who believed it already belonged to him. That was when the whole thing became uglier. Northreach held a company-wide meeting every month, the kind where leadership pretended transparency was a cultural value instead of a performance habit. The auditorium was half full, the stream was live for remote teams, and Daniel sat in the front row with the same calm pride I had seen in the investor room. Owen walked onto the stage with a clicker in his hand and my integration plan behind him again, only now he wasn't just presenting it. He was wearing it like a tailored suit. Why, he called it the operating model that proves Northreach is ready for the next era. Not the next quarter. Not the next financing step, the next era. He talked about modernization. He talked about speed. He talked about leadership that could scale with investor confidence. Then he referred to my work as execution support, and that phrase landed harder than I expected. 18 months of crisis work, client recovery, compliance cleanup, migration planning, and operational triage reduced to 2 words that made me sound like an assistant with a strong calendar. After the meeting, one of my directors stopped by my office, shut the door, and lowered her voice before she spoke. "Daniel's planning a special board session after diligence," she said. "They're talking about naming Owen president." I sat there for a second and let that settle. So, that was the shape of it. The investor presentation had been the introduction. The reporting changes had been the setup. The title was the real prize. That afternoon, HR sent me a draft retention package. It looked generous if you didn't read it carefully. A short-term cash incentive, a transition bonus, a vague reference to strategic realignment. Buried inside it was the real purpose. Reduced authority now, an orderly exit later, and just enough money to buy my silence until the financing closed. I almost admired the sequence. Steal the work, use the work, remove the witness, promote the son. But arrogance always has side effects. Once Owen started believing his own story, he began making promises that depended on work he did not understand. He froze part of a remediation budget to make operating margins look cleaner for diligence. And he told the finance team customer approvals were administrative. He pushed milestone dates my team had not signed off on. Then he sent me a follow-up invite for an investor prep call and added a note that said, "Join only in case technical clarification is needed." Technical clarification. That told me everything. He still needed my knowledge. He just wanted my credibility stripped off it. Then the first crack opened from the outside. One of our largest hospital clients requested a routine transition update. The invite came from Owen's office instead of mine, and their finance lead noticed immediately. She replied to a thread with a simple question. "Can you confirm who now holds integration authority under the continuity rider?" That was it. One line. But I knew what it meant the second I saw it. A smart client had noticed the handoff. A contractual trigger had been brought into daylight, and once that kind of question exists in writing, the temperature changes for everyone. Owen tried to reroute the thread away from me before I could respond. Too late. They were not just stealing credit anymore. They were scaling the lie into titles, budgets, investor promises, and client communications, and every extra step made the correction waiting for them more expensive, more public, and far more humiliating. The investor process changed shape the next Monday. Up to that point, Daniel and Owen had been living in presentation mode, which is the safest place for people like them. Slides are clean, rooms are controlled, questions stay broad. But once a financing starts moving into diligence, the theater ends and the real work begins. And that is where stories stop being admired and start being tested. By noon, the bank had asked for final management certifications. An operating partner from one of the lead funds requested a call on integration governance. An associate on the diligence team asked why a key client transition schedule had different approval names across 2 versions of the file. And then the hospital system that had noticed the meeting invite sent a second message. Has Northreach disclosed a material change in transition oversight under the continuity provisions? That question moved through the building like smoke. Suddenly, Daniel's family project was no longer office politics. It was a live diligence risk tied to revenue, disclosure, and governance. People who had ignored me for days started speaking more carefully in hallways. Legal went quiet. Finance got tense. Owen still tried to perform confidence, but it was thinner now, more polished than natural. Daniel called me into his office just before 6. He closed the door, took off his glasses, and gave me the tired, reasonable tone executives use when they are asking for something they know they do not deserve. "We need continuity here," he said. "The bank wants the final certification memo. Sign a shortened version so the process can keep moving. Owen will stay public-facing, but we need your support behind the scenes." There it was. He wanted my credibility without my authority. He wanted my name under a version of events he had already altered. I folded my hands in my lap and kept my voice level. I can't support a certification tied to materials that removed active risks, changed role descriptions, ate and ignored continuity conditions without correcting the record first. His face hardened. "This is not the moment to become difficult, Mara." "I'm not being difficult," I said. "I'm being accurate." That was the end of the meeting, though neither of us said so directly. Owen caught me near the elevators on my way out. He had his jacket off and his sleeves rolled up, trying to look like a hard-working executive instead of a protected child. "If this round gets damaged because you want to make a point," he said, "that'll follow you." I looked at him and said, "Then you should have been more careful about what you said in front of investors." His expression changed at that. Just for a second. Not fear yet, but the first hint of it. I went back to my office, opened the folder I had been building. Owen wrote one clean memo to Priya Shah and the audit committee. I attached the investor slides, the removed risk pages, the continuity rider language, and Owen's own written confirmation that no named person dependency remained. I did not use emotional language. I did not accuse anyone of fraud. I called it what it was, a governance issue requiring immediate review. Then I hit send and watched the message leave my screen. The lie that had looked polished under projector lights was now moving into the hands of lawyers, investors, clients, and a board committee that knew how to read. And for the first time, I could feel the room closing around the Vosses. The meeting happened the next morning at 8:30, and nobody called it an emergency out loud, which was how I knew it was one. When I walked into the conference room, the seating had changed. Daniel was no longer at the head of the table. Priya Shah was. Lena Ortiz was already there with outside counsel beside her. The lead banker had a folder open in front of him, but had not touched his coffee. 2 investor representatives were on the screen from New York. Owen stood near the windows at first, not sitting, like he still believed posture could save him. I carried one black binder and my laptop. That was all. I took the seat halfway down the table, set the binder in front of me, and looked around the room. Nobody smiled. Nobody made small talk. The air had that thin, metallic feeling serious meetings get when everyone knows the next 30 minutes might change careers. Priya opened with one sentence. "We are here to reconcile investor materials with governance records, client continuity obligations, Owen certification pathways." Daniel tried to jump in immediately. "This is really a communication issue that has been magnified." Priya lifted one hand without even looking at him. "You'll have time to respond." That was the first moment I saw it. Not panic, not yet, but the beginning of lost control. She turned to me. "Mara, start with the deck." So I did. I opened the version history and walked them through it page by page. I showed the original integration model developed by my office. I showed the working file dates. I showed the red risk pages my team had included. I showed the later edits where those pages disappeared. I kept my voice even. No speeches, no anger, just facts with timestamps. "This slide," I said, turning my laptop toward the room, "previously included unresolved claims mapping inside the Mercer acquisition. You removed at 6:14 p.m. 2 days before the investor presentation." I moved to the next file. This page contained a support staffing gap affecting 2 client migration windows, removed in the same edit cycle. Then the continuity language. This section originally reflected a client-specific approval condition tied to integration authority. That condition was removed before the materials were shown to investors. Owen finally sat down. Daniel tried again. "Mara is describing legacy materials that were under review." Lena spoke before I had to. "Were those revisions approved through legal?" Daniel looked at her, then at me, then back at Priya. "We were aligning presentation language." "That is not what I asked," Lena said. The banker lowered his eyes to the table. I opened the binder and slid copies across the room. A hospital continuity riders, board-approved integration governance, the certification path for the management representation package. Owen's email confirming that no named person dependency remained. That was the document that changed the room. One investor representative leaned closer to the screen. Who was expected to certify the package under this structure? I answered him directly. My office. Nobody spoke for a second. Then I explained the part Daniel had hoped would never be said clearly. I explained, in plain language, that the company had told investors integration risk was closed while removing active risk disclosures, sidelining the certifying function, and failing to address client provisions that allowed material questions if operational control changed without disclosure. I did not need dramatic words, and the truth was sharp enough on its own. Owen tried to recover. This is being framed like some kind of deception. It was a title evolution. The writers are old wording. I turned to him for the first time since the meeting began. You told investors there was no named person dependency, I said. Then you confirmed it in writing. Did you review the continuity writers before making that statement? He opened his mouth, but nothing useful came out. Daniel stepped in. This is becoming adversarial. Priya looked at him with open contempt. No, Daniel. This is becoming clear. That was the turn. I told them I had stayed silent in the investor meeting on purpose. If I had corrected Owen in the room, it would have been brushed aside as executive conflict. By letting him speak without interruption, and I let the company's chosen story enter the formal record. Now the gap between what had been claimed and what was true could not be softened into opinion. Priya asked Daniel one final question. Did the board approve any change to integration governance before these materials were distributed? He did not answer right away. Then he said, not formally. The banker closed his folder. One of the investors muted himself, which somehow felt worse than if he had started shouting. Owen tried one more time to blame support teams, legacy wording, misalignment, timing, anything but himself. Every word made him look smaller. Every interruption made me look steadier. They had brought me into the room thinking I was there to help rescue their deal. Instead, I became the only person in it who could explain what was true, what was false, and what had to happen next. Once power shifts in a company like that, it does not happen slowly. It happens all at once, and then people spend weeks pretending it was always the obvious outcome. By noon, Owen had been removed from all financing communications. His access to the investor data room was suspended. Every diligence response tied to integration, client transition, or readiness was routed through legal and my office. Daniel was told to step back from the process pending a governance review, which was the polite version. The real version was simpler. He was out. No one said the word collapse. They did not need to. The board spent the afternoon calling the lead funds, correcting the situation without admitting more than they had to. The investors did not walk away, which mattered, but they froze the round until the materials were fixed, the client issues were addressed, and the company could show that real operating control sat with somebody credible. For the first time since all of this had started, Northreach's future depended on truth instead of performance. That gave me a choice. I could have burned them. I had enough in that binder, enough in the email trail, enough in the document history to make the fallout bigger, uglier, and more public than it already was. A part of me wanted that, not because I am cruel, because humiliation has weight when it is deliberate, and Daniel had tried to erase me in front of people whose money he wanted while his son stood in my work like it was inherited property. But if I destroyed the company, I would also damage the teams who had kept it alive with me. The directors who had worked weekends. The implementation leads who had taken calls from furious clients at midnight. The analysts who had rebuilt broken migration maps 3 times because leadership kept selling certainty that operations had not finished building. So I made terms instead. Priya and Lena met me in a smaller room that evening. No audience, no theater, just paper. I told them exactly what I needed if they wanted me to stabilize the process. The investor materials had to be corrected in writing. The client continuity issue had to be disclosed properly and resolved directly. My authority over integration and certification had to be restored, not informally, but by board instruction. My team had to be protected from retaliation, and my compensation had to reflect the value they had tried to hide. Retention equity, a direct reporting protection during the transition period, and a formal appointment as interim chief operating officer until the financing closed and the operating structure was rebuilt. Priya did not blink. She said, "That is reasonable." Reasonable. After everything Daniel had done, that word felt almost funny. The board approved it before the day ended. A week later, corrected diligence materials went out. The headline numbers were slightly lower. The promises were cleaner. The risk language was honest. The investor story finally matched the real operating structure instead of a family fantasy built on my silence. 3 weeks after that, I walked back into the same investor room where Owen had used my work like a costume. This time, I was not in the back. Priya sat to my left. Lena sat near the end of the table, and the banker asked me to begin, and I did. I took them through the revised integration plan, the client protections, the remediation schedule, the true certification path, and the milestones we could actually stand behind. Nobody interrupted. Nobody redirected. When questions came, they came to me. And the strangest part was that the room felt calmer with the truth in it. The same investors who had watched Owen perform certainty now trusted the version that admitted complexity, because adults with real money do not need perfection. They need to know who is actually in control. Near the end of the meeting, the door opened once. Owen stepped in with a visitor badge clipped to his belt and no seat waiting for him. He stood near the wall for less than a minute before somebody from legal quietly asked him to wait outside. Daniel never came back at all. The round moved forward on honest terms. The company survived. My team stayed intact. And the architecture they had tried to steal remained exactly where it had always belonged. With me. I did not win because I shouted louder. I won because they mistook silence for weakness, paper for politics, and me for someone they could move out of the story after I had built it.